I'm going to take you through the game between Alexander Grischuk and Anish Giri from round 13, the penultimate round of the Candidates tournament. Absolutely crucial, of course, to the final standings. Giri just a half point behind Jan Nepomniachtchi going into this round. But also very interesting because not exactly clear what Giri would be playing for in this game. Would a draw be good for him? Hard to say, because Nepo was playing against Vacher-le-Grave. Vacher-le-Grave still had a theoretical chance of coming through if he won. So both those games, the players had to keep an eye on each other, basically. So that affected the opening choice and how they played in these games. So let's take a look. Don't forget, like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via Patreon or PayPal. So far, a Queen's Indian. Grischuk playing in a very orthodox way. Now it's something a little bit different. Instead of the normal bishop e7, we have a check. Well, it's not so unusual. But after bishop d2, instead of exchanging, or here a5, then c5 played. So this line, well, it's known. It looks a little bit bizarre to have this pawn take away from the center because it takes the pressure away from the d4 pawn. But it's a little bit unbalanced. And that's, I guess, what Giri wanted from this game. Something reasonably solid, but a little bit unusual. And I have to say, I admire the way Giri has played in this tournament, particularly the second half, because he's not afraid to play openings that he's, hasn't really dabbled with before. But he's trying to unsettle his opponent with a surprise, basically. And I think that's an aspect to his game that we haven't seen so much in the past. He's solid and has, I wouldn't say a fixed opening repertoire, but you can pretty much rely on what he's going to play. But this shows at this tournament that he's really broadened the kind of openings he's prepared to play, and that definitely makes it more difficult for his opponents to prepare against him. So Queen b3, what was interesting was that Grischuk wasn't spending too long over his moves. So he was obviously pretty familiar with this line. So maybe Giri was just a little bit unlucky with his opening choice. So for the moment, Black holds that pawn on b4. Rook d1. After about 13 minutes from Grischuk, so there you go. He wasn't playing so quickly, but thinking things through fairly carefully. Knight e1. Now this is the start of a very important maneuver, actually, as we'll see. So bishop's exchanged. Knight g2 has been played before, but Grischuk has something else in mind for that knight. King takes g2. So here's the idea. Basically, lots of paint on the board. The knight on c2 hits b4, so that basically clarifies the situation. And having forced that exchange, then you can see that this pawn on b6 is somewhat weaker. And, well, if you're going to pick a pawn structure, which pawn structure would you prefer? You've got to prefer white here. Rook b8, but it's not possible to win this pawn, but it is a long-term weakness. Pawn to e4, Nice centre, but e5. So this is standard for this opening. Black wants to try and, well, tempt that pawn forward, or maybe white exchanges. And the knight finds a square on c5. But of course white is not obliged to push that pawn or take, but can stay solid. Queen d3 is a nice move, threatening to push that pawn, so the knight has to duck back to c7. And rook b1. And that knight comes to e6. So it still has perhaps an eye to go into c5. For example, after d5, knight c5, black would be very, very happy. But like I said, white not obliged to go for that at all. So maybe Giri's got what he wants here. You know, it is quite a double-edged position. He has perhaps the chance to start an initiative on the king side. And just have a look at the kind of tactics available. If white plays h4 to block that, and the knight drops back, and if f3 to kind of solidify that structure, queen h4. Of course, that was on if white failed to play f3 or not. But yeah, with the idea of pawn takes, check, and takes the queen. So white has to be a little bit careful here. And Grischuk thought for almost 12 minutes. Got to watch out for h4. That could be quite annoying. But he played rook b5, putting a bit of pressure here, and perhaps looking to double on the b file. And here is a crunch moment for black. And Giri thought for just over 9 minutes, but maybe he didn't come up with the best move. Grischuk thought that maybe he should just come back. Knight c7, and then either, well, rook b2, and then put the knight back on e6. I mean, it is pretty solid. It's not clear that this has gained so much. An obvious move is h4, but knight f3 kind of clears up the situation. And, well, this kind of liquidation is quite typical for this line. The problem is at the end of it. Here's a very nice tactic actually. So this is threatened, and when the rook comes up, rook takes b6. So white wins back the pawn, of course, if rook takes. Knight check, and rook h1, mate. Anastasia's mate. The knight covering these squares. Now this is a very long line. I'm just showing you it's just a possibility. But this is kind of typical. And here, white is always a bit better. Now maybe black can draw these kind of positions because, you know, these pawns aren't the best. But, you know, white is always slightly better when it comes to liquidations, because there are weak pawns here, basically. And white is pretty solid. White's pieces are pretty good. So it's hard for black to generate serious winning chances, which is obviously what Giri wanted. Remember, you know, he had an eye on Nepo's game, and he could see that Nepo actually had a very, very promising position against Vacher-le-Grave. So he thought, I've got to try and play for a win here. But rook e8 allows white to really seal up the king side. h4, excellent move. g6, it's kind of a nothing move, but it's hard for black. f3, and that really solidifies white's position on the king side. You can't always get away with advancing a ref pawn like this. But in this case, there just isn't enough dynamism in black's position to shake white here. There aren't pawn breaks. You'd like to be able to play c6 and d5 or something, but well, obviously not happening here. Knight d7, knight f1. So that knight looking to come around to e3, and that is the dream square, e3, and then potentially knight d5. I've seen quite a few games in this variation. Well, two games I can think of that Karpov played actually, where in both he managed to bring that knight to e3, and basically that was the end of black's counterplay, because that knight really dominates. And here black is struggling. Both these pawns are weak, and there's no dark squared bishop to get play. These knights, well, they can be handled fairly easily. The queen just withdraws, and now Grischuk is in complete control of the position. Knight e3, there it goes. That knight controls these absolutely key squares in the position. And g4. And here, black needs a pawn break, so f5 is kind of the normal move. But it's just not very good. In fact, Giri played knight e7. But let's just have a quick look at f5. Obviously there's a pin here. Grischuk after the game indicated a long line with queen b2 and then f4, where he was somewhat better. And this is a really nice idea. It looks like it's even better to play, or very straightforward, to play queen d2, attacking this pawn, and if pawn takes pawn, again this idea with f4, this is such an attractive positional idea. So the knight turns into a blockader. So blockading the e-pawn means there is no play for black in the middle or on the king side. The knight controls these key squares, so the black queen cannot enter the position. So that knight and the pawn, they complement each other beautifully, controlling all those squares. And here, well, this is dreadful. If rook d8, defending that pawn, rook g5, a beautiful swing across, and black's king in terrible trouble, f5 coming. And if knight e7, well, white has won the pawn back. This one is dropping. It's hopeless for black. So this is Giri's problem. He hasn't got a dynamic break, and it's just a terrible position. If rook d8 defending d6, well, this is a line pointed out by Grischuk. Queen b2 hits b6, knight c8, c5, lovely symmetry. Pins on both the b and d files, and that pawn just can't be taken. f5. Queen takes pawn, so this is an absolutely hopeless endgame. And the game went like this. I should say the course of this game had an effect on Nepomniachtchi and Vasilograv's game, because Nepo had a nice advantage, but he decided to play quite conservatively and exchanged off lots of pieces, and even agreed a draw in a position where he could still play on, because he could see that Grischuk was going to win this one very easily. It's now 2 pawns, and this endgame is absolutely hopeless. Well, it doesn't really need my commentary. Grischuk, he has this reputation for being a time pressure addict and, playing some very creative moves, very wild stuff sometimes. But technically, he's actually very, very strong. And this position, he is just, well, very, very careful. And he understands how to control the position. So perfect technique from him. His king and knight dominating. And here Giri resigned. Or let me just show why. Obviously, king and pawn endgame is completely winning for white. If the knight moves away, d6, d7, threatening to queen. The king covers. And now you just take on h5. And the king and knight are just completely stretched. Easy win for white. It wouldn't make any difference if the pawns are being exchanged. You know, it's still basically an h-pawn going through. So that was the final position. A really convincing victory for Grischuk. And I think Giri got the opening wrong. I think he was unlucky. It's interesting, after the game, Grischuk revealed that he's actually had some training games with Anand in this opening. So he understood it very, very well. Grischuk also said, my plan was to play like a terrorist, to terrorize him with a draw. And if he goes for a worse position, then I'll play, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. If he played for equality, I would try to force a draw and most likely succeed. He played the line I was somewhat familiar with. And, well, he said roughly, he missed my point to play h4 and f3. So that's a significant moment in the game. So here, h4 and f3. And yeah, after that, it's very tough for black. He said he was imagining how it was for Giri. He said, you sort of want to win, but the position has no grounds for it. You don't want to play solidly. You try some tricks. Your position gets worse, of course. Your position degradates. What a wonderful word, degradates. So very interesting to see that Grischuk took into account what Giri wanted from this game and, well, played accordingly. He didn't want to push it that much because he realized that Giri would have to. Let's just have a very quick look at the final position of Yanni Pomnishi against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, which was this. And they agreed to draw they repeated moves while the Grischuk-Giri game was still going on. Nepo could see Grischuk was going to win. You can see Nepo is pawn up. Now this is a very difficult position to win because of this nice blockade. Nevertheless, white could play this on. For example, putting the knight on d2. Protecting that one. That'll free the knight. And, maybe you can start advancing on the king side as well. But there was no need for Nepo to. So basically, after the results, Yanni Pomnishi is a point clear going into the final round, which means that even if Nepo loses and Giri wins, Nepo would win on tiebreaks. So that means that we have a new challenger. Nepo has won the tournament. I should say Yanni Pomnishi has won the tournament. And he will challenge Magnus Carlsen for the world title in November in Dubai. It's going to be fascinating. Personally, I'm very glad. I think Nepo is a very interesting opponent for Carlsen. I think it'll be an interesting clash. Nepo is somehow prepared to take risks. He's very creative. Of course, technically very good, as we've seen in this tournament. But prepared to play, slightly unusual openings. Don't forget, at the start of the tournament, he was playing the French, an opening that's a little bit shunned at the top level these days. So it's going to be fascinating. Anyway, do follow my video for tomorrow as well. Tournament isn't quite over, although the last round will be something of an anticlimax. I won't say anything more about Magnus Carlsen against Jan Nepomniachtchi. Not yet. There's going to be plenty of time to gauge their form over the next few months. Anyway, thanks for watching.